I just listened to Christopher Reeves reading Edgar Allan Poe's A Telltale Heart on YouTube. And it kind of reminded, well, first of all, I'll give a brief summary of the story, even though I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. About It's narrated by this unnamed character who has this really horrible, almost kind of mind-eating obsession with this old man who he's been stalking, primarily because of the old man's eye. That there's one eye that's like what he calls a little vulture eye. It's this piercing, pale blue, and he can't, and it haunts him. And eventually, he decides to take this man's life. And so he eventually, one day, he shows up at the old man's house, and he is filled with seemingly all these hallucinations of hearing hell, heaven, everything, the earth, all the sounds of the earth, hell and heaven, and and his senses are described as being more acute because of madness. Right, and that's another very interesting point, I would say, is how the way he's deluded himself into thinking that madness has actually been sort of a source of genius, or kind of a muse for him, a guide. And eventually, yeah, he shows up, he kills the old man, he's arrested, and at the very end, he hears this beating heart below the floorboards, and he thinks that it's the old man's, even though he's already dead and dismembered, right? And I think that this brings me back to a point that I believe I've talked about a long time ago, and I want to bring it up again, which is that I think in the best kind of horror, the best kind of horror genre is, and I think really when horror and comedy kind of become two sides of the same coin, right? When he just touches on that level of absurdity that doesn't actually make something less profound. It actually makes it more profound. It's like, the fact that it's he didn't do the usual thing. It's not about wanting the old man's money. It's not about wanting his beauty, his fortune, or whatever it is, right? It's just about an eye. It's that fixation. It's that sort of, it's the messiness and the ugliness of something that really makes something much more powerful, I think. I think it ties into something that if I could go back to, I think that one book that I was working on, I think I told you about the first book of my book series, about a debauched nobleman named John Roe who kidnaps a child prodigy named Edmund. Right, that kind of depravity and absurdity is something that I think, really trying to achieve in that character, but was struggling a little more. And I think that this story that I've just listened to is a good blueprint, not to imitate, obviously, but gives me a good idea of what that takes. Like, I like how he really does not hold back. Right, and that's sort of what I mean when I say that, when I talk about absurdity or comedy and horror being two sides of the same coin, right? That he doesn't impose those sort of limitations on himself, and that gives his imagination more latitude. But I think that when it comes to John Roe, one area that I do think that I did succeed in was giving him that very ambiguous quality of him presenting as very pathetic and in many ways unlikable, but you can't really tell whether he's just a moron or whether he's highly intelligent, right? He's it's like he's even described as being emotionally blind, and yet he can manipulate people. And how is that possible? It's like his mind is almost on an animal level, but he's very cunning in other ways, and also physically very strong, right? And so he has that sort of animal nature that, in many ways, is carried by the same self-delusion, I think, that this character in The Telltale Heart has. Right, and Edmund, on the other hand, in my book series, is that symbol of purity, and he never caves into the madness. He sees through it, and he becomes ultimately a rival against that madness, and that's ultimately that's really what makes John Rowe the angriest.